Ground bait is one of the most important parts of your bait armoury when it comes to fishing, and whether you're a match angler, a pleasure angler, it doesn't matter. There's a place in your fishing game for a nice bit of ground bait, and I want to show you exactly how we go about mixing it. We're going to talk about mixing fish meal ground baits, we're going to talk about mixing cereal ground baits, we're going to look at the bits and pieces that you need to get the most from your ground bait. Now in this video we're going to hopefully put together a nice little guide that will get you on your way to getting the most from ground bait. Now the first thing we need to talk about are the bits and pieces that you need to mix ground bait. Now as you can see here, I've got a few different things, and it kind of depends on what kind of level you're going to use and what your level you're fishing at as to how much of this equipment you really need. Like if you're an angler who just goes for a few hours pleasure fishing, you're only going to need a pint or two of ground bait. But if you're a more serious match angler who goes on rivers, you might need to mix up larger quantities of ground bait. So that all reflects that with all these different bits and pieces going. Now the first thing that has to be said is that ground bait is easy to mix in a round bowl. It be that something like this if you're only doing a small amount, which is the bowl from the ball and ring, or in a ground bait bucket like this. A round container is better. Something like this is great for fishing from and storing your bait in when you've actually got it mixed up and ready, like when this, because it fits nice and neat on your side tray. But actually mixing your ground bait in a square container like this, it's not really optimum. You want something nice and round so you can get a nice even mix. So just think about that. Like I say, if you are just mixing a little bit, something like that, a nice little round bowl will do you proud. But like I say, if you are going to look at mixing larger quantities, then you're going to want a bucket. And I think something like this is ideal. This is a ringer's bucket. It comes with a lid, so obviously if you get a bit of rain or whatever, you can cover your ground bait. But what I really like about this is this, it's got a bowl inside the bucket, which is nice. Obviously you can mix your ground bait in there, and then it gives you somewhere to put your riddle in, mix up smaller amounts in this bowl, or transfer it into there to help you mix the two bits if you like doing a bit more ground bait. So having the bowl there as well as your bucket is a nice little feature. So pop that in there, lid on top, absolutely great. So really recommend that if you are mixing larger amounts of ground bait, but if not, something smaller like that. Now when it comes to actually mixing the ground bait, you can do it in two ways. You can use your hands, or you can use one of these whisks and a power drill. And again, it all depends on what you're doing, what style of fishing you're doing. I mainly do commercial fishing, so I'm mixing generally smaller amounts of ground bait. A kilo of ground bait is kind of the most that I ever mix up really. So I do it by hand. I'm quite happy to do it by hand. And we'll show you a few different styles of doing it by hand. But if you are a river angler and you're mixing a kilo, 2 kilos, even 3 kilos up, you know, if you're balling it in or you're fishing a baller chuck style, then something like this, a drill whisk, is absolutely invaluable. It makes it so much easier and you get a beautiful finish. Of course you can use a drill whisk for a kilo or less of ground bait, but you can do that pretty well by hand anyway. But I really do recommend one of these if you are mixing large amounts, particularly in natural ground baits as well. This makes it so much easier. So drill, absolute must. And then the final one is a riddle. Now I prefer this style rather than the old wire ones. The old wire ones used to get a bit sticking up and used to catch your hand on it, but a few companies do this sort of style of riddle now, and they're absolutely essential. A riddle, just once you mix up ground bait, you get a lot of lumps, and we don't want them. They're just extra bits of ground bait that have got a bit too much moisture in them, and we want rid of that. Riddle will allow you to do that. Pop your ground bait on there, push it through straight into your bucket like that because it sits on there nicely. Absolute winner. So they're the bits that you kind of need, and like I say, once you've mixed up in your bucket or your bowl or this sort of bowl, whichever one you choose to mix up in, then transfer it into something smaller like this to actually fish from, because obviously the square shape fits on your side tray much neater than a round bowl. So they're the bits that you're going to need for mixing your ground bait. So let's have a look at the ground baits themselves. Ground bait is really good, but not as good as the Nufish YouTube channel. So why not press that subscribe button, give us a like and leave a comment down below what video you'd like us to do next. Okay, so walk into any tackle shop and you're going to be met with a wall of ground baits, and there's loads of different ones from loads of different great brands. You can't really go wrong, they're all excellent. And this video, we're not actually talking about ground bait choice. We're not going to say this one's better than that one or whatever. That's not what we're doing here. We're just looking at ground bait as a whole. And I think there's probably two main categories that we can talk about with ground bait. Now the first are cereal mixes. Now something like this Vandenheim Beats or this Black River from Sonia Baits, they're what I'd class as cereal ground baits. So they're like the natural end. They're what you would use on rivers, canals. You would use them on lakes and commercials and stuff, but they're like a bread, biscuit, cereal based ground bait. Very much for natural venues. And they need to be mixed in a slightly different way. They're much stickier often, they've got a lot of different particles in there, they don't swell up quite as much as fish meal ground baits, which we'll talk about in a moment. So they do need a bit of more love and care when it comes to the mixing process. So cereal mixes, like I say, they tend to have the label on, like the sensor, so the classic one would be like Lake or River, like this one's Beat, there's Special, Secret, Super Cup, things like that, natural sort of names. But if you don't know, just ask the guy in the shop, he'll tell you what ground baits to look for different situations. Like I say, the natural ones tend to be a bit more bindy, you can use them on deeper rivers and things like that. And then we've got the fish meal style ground baits, so you've got things like F1, you've got Sweet Skimmer, we've got Match Method Mix, things like that. They're a totally different animal, they've got fish meal in them. You can smell them, you get any in your hand if you haven't smelt them before. Get a handful of it, it absolutely stinks to high heaven. And I would say in the UK that fish meal ground baits are probably 80% of what people are using nowadays. I know in my personal fishing, it's probably more than that. 95% is fish meal. Whether you're targeting bream on natural venues, carp on commercials, F1s, skimmers on lakes and stuff like that, fish meal has really come to the fore. And it's good because it's dead easy to mix. They're pretty foolproof fish meal ground baits, and it is different, the process for mixing fish meal ground baits to cereal. So let's have a look at the fish meal ones first, how we're going to mix them, and then we'll have a look at the cereal ones after that. Right, so let's have a look at some fish meal ground bait. Now I'm going to use Sonia Baits F1 to start with. Now this is a very forgiving ground bait. You can put loads of water in this, you can't really get it wrong. Fish meal ground baits tend to take on a lot of water, and you can kind of overdo it and you can still get them back. They take off, they're a bit like a sponge, they'll absorb water over a period of time. So you can mix this very wet at the start and it'll go like horrible like a soup, and then you come back to it half an hour later and it'll be bone dry. So just be mindful of that, it is quite forgiving. Obviously different ground baits, different fish meal ground baits are slightly different, so obviously your mileage might vary, but Sonia baits for instance are quite forgiving across the range. Now in terms of actually mixing the ground bait, I like to measure it out, and I like to do it with little pint containers. So if you're just going pleasure fishing, a pint of ground bait goes an awful long way, especially with ground baits such as Sonia baits, because they swell up so much. So if you are just going for a few hours, mix up a pint, you'll get loads of fishing done with that. So let's mix 2 pints of ground bait up. One, just gonna get 2, just less, but that'll do for now. And then it's probably not 2 to 1, but it's just under. So we'll go with, because we had a little bit less than 2 pints, maybe in the blagger that I am, I'm going to put in half of one of them. And as you get more and more experience, you'll get a feel for this. And with fish meal ground baits, like I say, they're ever so forgiving, and you actually, because they take on so much water, you do want to saturate them. It allows them particles to expand, and like I say, when you've mixed it up, it'll almost like double in volume. So just be mindful of that. It can look very damp at first, don't panic, just be sort of mindful that it will take on plenty of water. You can almost feel it, look, it's drying up as I'm doing it, but that is a great starting point. So we had just less than 2 pints of ground bait, and then we put in half of one of them of water, and we've got a peacock on the job. We're going to have a lovely ground bait there, and now all you need to do is put that to one side and let it sort of come round. You notice we haven't done a little bit of water, a little bit of water, a little bit of water. That'll come when we mix the cereal ground baits. I much prefer to put a dollop of water into my fish meal ground baits and let it set. So I'll just put that to one side, and we'll come back in 20 minutes time, and then we'll run it through a riddle, and then we might have to just tweak it with a little bit more water, but pretty much that'll be good to go. Okay, so our F1 has had probably 20 minutes just to set, and as you can see, I kind of like to just press it into a corner and just leave it, and that's just taken on all that water now, and it's pretty dry, to be honest with you. So what we're going to do, we're going to break it up with our hands, and then we're going to pop it through nice little ground bait riddle. So let's just fluff it up, and as you can see, look at that. Even just doing that with our hands, you're actually getting a decent result, to be fair. You could run that through your hands like so, and you're going to have a nice ground bait there that you can pretty much use for all sorts of different styles of fishing. But I'm a big believer in doing things properly, so we are going to pop it through the riddle. But that just shows you how easy the old fish meal ground baits are, and particularly the ones that have got crushed expander. You'll see them in the shops that say crushed expander on the bag. If they've got that, they're very, very easy to prepare. they just take on loads of water. So anyway, let's pop it through this riddle. And this is where this whole system comes in, because we've got the bowl, what we've mixed up in, and then we've got the riddle that fits on the bucket. So let's pop that through there. You can shake it through or you can press it through, it's up to you. I just like to quickly press it through there. And of course riddles come with different gauges, wire gauges, and it kind of depends what you're trying to do. I find that I think this is a 4mm, I find this is a good all-round one, but they do much finer ones if you do want to get a nice fine ground bait, should you be fishing on canals or what have you. But for my fishing, that kind of riddle does me proud. So as you can see, let's pop it back in here. We've got a lovely ground bait there, and it took us no time at all to prepare it, dead easy. It mixes up, we can pop that in balls, we could put that on a feeder, we could put it in a cage feeder, you could pop it in with a pole pot loose, you could do anything with that, and that is the versatility of fish meal style ground baits. So that's how easy that was. Let's have a look at some cereal ground baits. Just as a quick point, if you do want a rough guide as to whether you've got your consistency right, this is a good little tip. If you make a ball like that, and then rub it back between your hands, and it goes back to like a nice sort of ground bait again, you're not far off. That's pretty much a good standard consistency. So if you do that, make a nice ball, rub it through your hands, and it goes back to ground bait, you're not far off. Okay, so let's have a look at mixing cereal ground baits. Now, these are a bit more temperamental, they're less forgiving. You'll have seen other videos of ground bait mixing where people are adding little bits of water at a time, and that is a good practice here when it comes to cereal ground baits. They're a lot stickier. A lot of them have got maize in, ground up maize, which actually takes a long time once it's wetted to become sticky. So it actually becomes stickier. So it can be really like troublesome. Sometimes you can push these ground baits too far and you'll never get them back. So they're not like the fish meal ground baits that we talked about. We're going to have a look at the drill, but first we're going to do it by hand, and I'm just going to show you. You can do it by hand, no problem at all, but it is easier with a drill, but we'll show you by hand first. So I'm just going to mix up a bit of this beet, and I'll tell you what, when you've just mixed up a load of fish meal ground bait, something like that just smells divine, absolutely beautiful. But you can see in there, it's already a totally different thing. There's bits of maize in there, there's bits of biscuit, there's bits of all sorts in there. Totally different style of ground bait, and of course these were really popular back in the 90s and 2000s and stuff. Unfortunately they're not as popular now, as we do a lot more commercial fishing, but they are still brilliant for what they're meant for, like river fishing and stuff. And I'm going to be much more careful with my water now. I am literally going to add a little bit at a time. So let's just put a dribble in to start with, and we're mixing it. And again, we're looking for a similar consistency as to what we achieved with the other ground bait, but I'm much more careful not to push it to where it's too wet. And this takes a bit of time. It's worth taking a bit of time. You can see that's not actually that far off of our first wet in there, but it's worth taking time and actually mixing it and then coming back to it, and then mixing it and riddling it and coming back to it will pay off with natural ground baits. I'm just going to dribble in a touch more there. It smells, honestly, I've wetted it, it smells beautiful, this does. I'd quite like to be doing a bit of roach fishing with this right now. But as you can see, it's a bit claggier, we've got a few more lumps in there, but ultimately that's coming together quite nicely. Now, because I'm sort of looking for this ground bait to carry a bit of loose feed, I'd imagine putting a few casters in there, a bit of worm, a few maggots, that kind of thing. It does need to bind together. So I'm just looking at that and I'm just having a feel, see what it's like. It's not bad that as a wetness ground bait. As a starting wet, I'm going to go with that. I'm just going to leave that in that bowl now for probably 10 minutes, and then I will come back to it, and in the meantime we'll have a look at the drill. But that's not a bad starting point. And I keep saying it, but that smells beautiful. So that by hand, little bits of water, come back to it. It takes a bit of time, but it's worth doing to get it absolutely bang on. So that's the by hand, little bits at a time. Honestly, that's beautiful ground bait, that is. Let's have a look at the drill. Now, same principle applies, but it means that you probably won't have to whisk it as much. So let's do it with this one. Got some Black River. Again, I've used this one quite a lot. It's quite a sticky ground bait, this one. Again, smells beautiful. And what we've got to be mindful of, that this actually gets stickier as it's been mixed. River ground baits tend to have some sort of binder in there that actually activates once it's wet. So when you first do it and you first squeeze it, it might not feel too sticky, but just come back to it in 10 minutes and it might feel a bit more sticky too. So let's just fob that in there, and we're going to use the whisk. Now loads of companies do one of these. You'd need a proper bit of kit, a nice bit of drill there, nice and powerful, plenty of torque on it. It's not too bad when you're only mixing up a kilo of ground bait, but if you are mixing 2 kilos, 3 kilos, like we sometimes are when we go on rivers, then you're probably going to want a proper bit of kit like this that'll make absolute piecework of mixing up large quantities of ground bait. And as you can see, this is a nice dark ground bait, Black River, one of my favourites. That is an absolute beauty. And again, you'll notice when we mix that, it doesn't take anywhere near as much water as well, so that's just worth bearing in mind. These ingredients that they use for these cereal ground baits are nowhere near as absorbent as the old expander ground baits. So let's get this drill in there, and we're just gonna gently feel, a bit more than that, but you can see it's coming together, and already it's looking lovely and fine, absolute beautiful. You see why the whisk is so effective. We're probably not actually far away. Look at that, beautiful. I'm just going to wet that up a touch more, but the difference already I can see from mixing it by hand compared to whisking it is unbelievable. Whisks are great. So a bit more water in there. And that is not far away from how we want it. So that'll do for now. We're going to, again, same rules apply as what we did with the one we did by hand. We're going to come back in sort of 10-15 minutes, because that will have dried out quite a lot, and then we can add the final bits of water and get it through the riddle. But the difference that makes with that whisk, yes, it's a bit noisy, and obviously you've got to have a drill and a whisk and everything, but it does make mixing so much easier. And like I say, cereal ground baits can be a little bit problematic, but that whisk doesn't have to make it easy. So let's let them set and let them take that water on, and then we'll come back to it and finish this ground bait off. While we're waiting for this ground bait to sort of take on that water and we'll apply those finishing touches, there's 2 points that I commonly get asked for. The first one, can you freeze ground bait? Yes, you can. However, the consistency and the texture and the stickiness will be affected by freezing. If you're just putting it in down the edge loose, not a problem. But if you're using a river ground bait, for instance, and you're relying on that stickiness to get your bait to the bottom, the freezing process will affect that. So it won't stop you catching fish, but just be mindful that the mechanics of the ground bait, as in you might choose a sticky river type ground bait, will be affected, and especially true with the fish meal ones. If you're using like a method feeder ground bait or something like that, that you need a bit of tack to get it around the feeder, it can lose that in freezing. So you won't catch any less fish, they won't be put off by the freezing process, but the texture and the stickiness might be affected. Another question we often get asked is when to mix your ground bait. Should you do it the day before, the night before, in the morning? It's kind of horses for courses. The closer you mix your ground bait to the match, especially with natural ground baits, the more active they'll be. Those little bits of particles won't have as long to take on water. And if you want a nice active mix, say you're roach fishing and you want lots of bits popping off your ground bait, which can be the case, mix it as close to your match start as possible. However, if you want a dead ground bait that's totally inert on bottom, maybe you're fishing for bream, tench, and you just want something that's dead on the bottom, so those big fish can come and graze, mixing it a day before, a night before is much better. So if you want nice inert ground bait, do it the night before. If you want something very active, do it as close to your session start as possible. Within reason, of course, you've still got to give it time to take on the water. But as a golden rule, big fish the day before, small fish the day of. Right, so we've given that ground bait plenty of time there, and as you can see, it's taken on the water now nicely. It's crumbly, but it's probably a touch dry now. And all we just need to do now is just tweak it until we get to the desired consistency. Now, again, we're working here with like rules of thumb. There are situations where a really bone dry ground bait is good, especially for like small roach and stuff like that. Sometimes a bone dry ground bait creates a big cloud, a lot of activity in your swim, and it can really work. But as a general rule, you want it nicely wetted so you can get a bit of feed in there and it gets to the bottom. So that's kind of what we're looking at here, a nice mid-range sort of texture. So we're going to push that on a little bit more. It won't need a lot of water, this, to get it how I want it. So we just need to be careful. And I can feel that. You can feel the moisture in the ground bait with this one. Lovely ground bait, this. I'm just going to try it. Again, a lot more involved mixing cereal ground baits. And that ain't far away. It's just a tiny, another little tweak, and then we'll give it a riddle to get that finished consistency we're after. And again, that whisk, although it is noisy and a bit of a faff, don't know how to make it easier. So that is a nice consistency, that's binding nicely. You can get some bait in that, no problem. So let's get that through the riddle and look at how the finished mix is before coming back to the one we've done with the whisk. So again, you can see why I like this bucket and bowl setup so much, because it all works together, it's great. Let's get that in there, pass that through, so we'll shake that through and then press it through like that. And there we go, beautiful mixed up natural ground bait that is. That'll be perfect on a river, canal, lake, targeting silverfish. You ain't going to go far wrong with that, that's beautiful. Absolutely lovely. Now let's have a look at the one we did with the whisk, because as you remember, I mentioned that probably don't even need to riddle this one. And I can feel again, it's really dried out. It's still sticky because that's the nature of this style of ground bait. It's still quite sticky, but we are going to need to add a little bit more water. This is a river ground bait, so I'm anticipating fishing in deeper water, carrying a bit of bait to the bottom, so we've got to make it sticky enough to do that job. And just put a bit more water in. Beautiful. Absolutely, look at that. That will just go straight to the bottom. Be good in a feeder if you wanted to, but generally this is a pole ground bait. Absolutely beautiful. And that, having that whisk saves you so much hassle in terms of riddling. If you can see that ground bait is good to go. No lumps, no massive dry patches or wet patches or anything like that. Absolutely beautiful. So two ways of doing the natural ground baits there. We've got the by hand, by drill. Again, it's horses for courses. If you're only doing small amounts, do it by hand. But if you are using larger amounts regularly, do yourself a favour, get a drill. Just a quick point about drill use. A common question is, should you do it on the bank or at home? I much prefer, if I'm going to do a drill, do it at home. It's a bit obnoxious in it, using a drill on the bank. But if you do have to do it on the bank, do yourself a favour, don't do it on your peg. Get well back, do it at the van or the car, do it well away from the riverside. I just think having this clattering around, the noise it makes, might not put the fish off, but I can't see it doing any favours, especially on natural venues where you're more likely to use this. So yeah, use the drill and whisk, but just be mindful of where you're using it. Now, a question I recently got asked on my YouTube channel was how to mix slop. I use slop an awful lot throughout the summer months. I use it for F1 shallow, it's good for throwing in the edge. It's just a great fish attractor. It leaves a big cloud in the water. And of course, what I'm talking about is sloppy ground bait that's like almost like a paste, like wet to touch. It's a great fish attractor. No matter where you use it, it's going to attract you some fish. And mixing it is super simple. It is just over wet ground bait. So say you've got your ground bait that you've mixed up and taken lovingly a bit of attention, making sure that that's nice and mixed perfect. We're going to destroy that. So what I like to do when I am mixing slop, or I do intend to mix slop, I like to put the water in first. So actually mixing it backwards. So let's just put a bit of water in there, and then we're just going to put in a bit of ground bait, and we're just literally trying to get it to a consistency where we could either throw it or pot it in. Like if you can only pot it in, you can get away with the slop being a little bit wetter. If you've got to throw it, then you need to obviously make it a little bit firmer. But that is as simple as it is. You've just got a totally oversaturated ground bait, and you'll end up with a lovely sort of wet mix like that. It's as simple as that. And trust me, that's a simple little trick, that is, mixing slop. But if you, even in the middle of winter, pot a bit of that in, you are going to attract fish. It is absolutely fantastic. And you throw it in the edge and it just creates a lovely sort of milky cloud. Like I say, if you are throwing it in, it's going to need to be a little bit stiffer. Obviously just put a bit more dry in there. But if you want it really attractive and you're just potting it in out of the pole cup, then you can have it super wet. But that is as easy as slop is to prepare. Just totally saturate your ground bait, and that is a proven winner. Okay, so I make no apologies for that going on a bit, but there are lots of different little details that especially if you're a newcomer to using ground bait, you might not know. So I thought I want to cover as much as I can in plenty of detail, and then you can take from it what you want. Groundbait is super effective no matter where you go. It's a massive tool and it will help you with your fishing. You'll attract fish, it allows you to feed in deeper water. It just is just a brilliant, you just can't go fishing without it. It's just brilliant stuff. So I've shown you lots of different ways to go about it, what you need, what look like groundbaits and sort of styles you need and how to mix them. Hopefully that's really helpful. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again on the Nufish channel.